right. Yeah, thanks for being here. I'm Cheyenne. I'm a reporter at CoinDesk. I don't normally write about Helium and HiveMapper, but I have before, so hopefully I know a little bit. Yeah, do you guys want to go ahead and introduce yourselves?
Sure. I'm Ariel from HiveMapper. So I started in the mapping industry many, many years ago. I was director of products for Yahoo Maps. That's where I discovered how damn expensive it is to build maps. We got our ass kicked. I'll talk more about this when we get to details. Then left that, started another company before HiveMapper called GitCoin, which is also kind of in this global data collection network, and then started HiveMapper about 5 or 6 years ago. It's been a wild, crazy, fun journey.
Hey, I'm Kevin Owocki from GitCoin, which is a place that you can get coins if you're working on the commons in the Ethereum ecosystem. Every quarter we give away $3 million worth of matching funds contemporaneously with the crowdfunding campaign. And the way quadratic funding works is that it matches based off of the number of contributors to the grant, not the amount that they receive, which creates more democracy in how your ecosystem is funded. And glad to be here. Have heard really great things about Helium. Thanks for having me.
I'm Andy Chatham. I'm one of the founders of DIMO. We're building an open connected vehicle platform. And we have a couple thousand cars that are streaming data to DIMO today. It's built by a pretty incredible team of close to 20 folks with deep expertise in the automotive Web3 space, heavily inspired by Helium. Started out mining Helium very early on, and yeah, excited to be here.
Awesome. Okay. So, today we're talking about public goods and why it's imperative that we build them together. So I want to start with a broad question, and I'm just curious what your take is on, why do we need to collectively create public goods? What does, say, HiveMapper have that Google Maps doesn't? I feel like I know the answer, but...
Sure. So the thing is, when we talk about... let me back up in terms of maps, right? So everyone understands, obviously everybody uses Google Maps to some degree, right? And so that's probably like 75% of market share globally. The Apple Maps, in my view, is very similar to Google Maps in terms of it's built by them, it's owned by them, it's proprietary to them, they own most of the cars, airplanes associated with data collection and so forth. So I'll put that in one side, right? That's Apple and Google. On the other side, you have something called OpenStreetMap. So OpenStreetMap is effectively like the Wikipedia of maps. And so it's these people, hundreds of thousands of them all over the world, sitting there manually curating a map, right? And it's very, very tedious work. They've been at it since like 2005. And that data is free, right? So now what's happened over the last 4 or 5 years as that data quality's improved is now you have big companies, Amazon, Microsoft, Uber, using OpenStreetMap. And all of those contributors got zero, right? So Amazon is free to monetize that data and charge their customers for it. Likewise, Microsoft and Uber can as well. And so, look, I think that although OpenStreetMap has definitely created something of value, all of those people who spent years of their lives manually editing this map got zero upside associated with that. And I think, quite frankly, they feel burned. So I do think there's this opportunity to create a public good, but a public good that actually has ownership and monetization built around it. And so that's fundamentally what we're trying to do. We're saying is, look, if you're going to help build this map with us, you're going to own part of that map. And as the map grows and there's an ecosystem and an economy that grows around the map, then potentially you participate in the upside associated with that.
Andy?
So DIMO stands for Digital Infrastructure for Moving Objects. A lot of people don't realize that. And it is built by a team of people that have spent, on average, between 8 to 10 years in the mobility space. And the mobility world is really one that, 99% of the value is enabled by public goods. You experience that every time you drive on a road that is nicely paved, or not. And so we really appreciate the value of that. It's something that, when it's functioning well, you totally miss it. And a lot of us were working in the space and realized that as cars become more digitally enabled, features like electrification and autonomous driving are really going to require a new generation of public goods in order to be able to scale up and actually deploy in the way that's going to make people's lives better. And so I spent a lot of time in the autonomous vehicle space and realized that all of these companies, building products sort of like they're building Google Maps, and obviously the Google autonomous driving effort and Google Maps are very closely related. We don't really want to wind up in a world where one company vertically controls all the autonomous driving software on open public roads. Connected vehicle software today is looking very siloed, and a lot of applications that could be built with those endpoints opened up, whether it's new insurance products or better ways to charge electric vehicles and manage the grid. None of that's really possible because there's not an open developer platform for cars. So that's kind of the first step that we're taking, is really just making it possible for people to create these next generation public goods. And in the mobility space, so much of it is already decentralized and so much of it is already heavily reliant on public goods. We just need to be able to sort of upgrade that for the digital world that we live in.
So public goods are good. That's the meme. And the reason for that is, the reason that I think that we have a huge opportunity in the blockchain space is to help fund public goods, is now that we have digital money that we can program our values into, and if we value public goods, then we can create business models for those public goods, which are good. And where GitCoin got its start was with open source software. There was a study in 2013 that said that about $400 billion per year in economic value is created by open source software. This is before Bitcoin and Ethereum had grown much, so it's just Web 2 open source software. And part of the problem is that because open source is available for free, the code is available for free, there's no real way to monetize it. And you see a lot of open source software developers have to work at big banks or big companies during the day, and then like nighttime away from their family, code open source and build our digital infrastructure. So there's a fundamental asymmetry between value created by open source software developers and the value that they can capture because their code is available for free online. And we, by the way, out of sight, out of mind. So our physical infrastructure is funded and built by the governments, but they haven't caught up and aren't really funding our digital infrastructure yet. So that the opportunity that I see in the blockchain space is that we can build these monetary systems that have the value of public goods built in at the base layer. But the more visceral way of making the argument is there's $1 trillion worth of capital, or there was $1 trillion worth of capital in the open source financial system. All of the money that used to go to some back office on Wall Street in the old financial system could now be going to open source software developers. And GitCoin wants to build the rails through which those developers find the coins and the coins find the developers. So open source is my home as far as public goods, but there are many adjacent public goods. I happen to care a lot about climate change. It's great to be surrounded by people who are talking about mobility and transportation networks as public goods as well. And public goods are good. Hopefully what we discover in each of these niches, we can cross-pollinate and share across all of them.
Yeah, so I feel like what I'm hearing is that by incentivizing participation and building collectively, we're finding a way to make sure that the people that are actually working are getting paid for it and not being taken advantage of. Is that where crypto comes in? Is this possible to do without crypto, or is crypto the foundation of incentivizing this?
I think you could do it without, in our case, I think you could do it without crypto. And so, okay, a little bit of context in terms of HiveMapper. We actually started doing it in a cash-based system. And so we've been around for a bunch of years, started with this vision of how do we build a global map. So we really came probably to crypto the same way that Helium did, right? Frank was mentioning this before earlier, was like, we were trying to build a map, right? That was our objective, that is still our objective. And crypto is really a means to an end. And so in a cash-based system, a couple things. One is we, HiveMapper, would never be able to pay the early contributors, the first 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 contributors, enough cash relative to the value that they are actually creating long term, right? Because if the thing works and it's massive, it's a huge map worth $100 billion, $200 billion, whatever number you want to put on it, you can only probably pay those people in the early days $5,000, $10,000, $15,000 a year. But relative to the value they're creating in terms of creating a global map, that's nothing, quite frankly. The other thing is that you're effectively playing on, in our case, Google's turf or Apple's turf, people who frankly have much bigger balance sheets. And so they could come, see that the model works, and say, OK, rather than paying each contributor who's mapping a tile 5 cents, screw that. We're going to pay them 20 cents, right? We pay them 50 cents, right? Because they have that kind of balance sheet relative to a start. I mean, even if we raise like $500 million, right, it still would, they would have the advantage. And the last part is, I think there's something really important about ownership, right? Transactions are obviously important to an economy, but ownership instills loyalty, confidence, pride in a way that transactions doesn't.
Yeah, we had a very similar experience at the beginning of DIMO. We had a client approach us through a consulting business, a venture studio that I was running with a couple of the founders of DIMO, and they said we want verified data streams from electric vehicle batteries, and that set us down the path of developing the hardware device. And we thought through the process of, okay, we could pay people $50 to put it in their car if they have a new model electric vehicle, and realized ultimately that the technology we were developing to do that and make sure that people were actually plugging it into their vehicle really was much more general purpose, and ultimately could enable a much more healthy ecosystem around vehicle data and really ultimately any IoT device data, because these are expensive machines that people buy and have a very deep emotional connection with, and ultimately a relationship where the OEM of that machine controls every aspect of it, and many of those features are digitally enabled, is pretty unhealthy. We saw what was happening with the data from a lot of connected cars that are rolling off of the assembly line, and ultimately realized there's this amazing alignment between what users want, what's good for society as a whole. It would be great if we knew who was making the best batteries and how to get them more capital to do that faster. And also ultimately what the companies want, because it makes their product better if all of the software developers in the world can use their creativity to build apps on top of their product, versus what a lot of people experience today as a pretty terrible connected vehicle experience. When you open up the app, pretty much everybody I talk to, except for Tesla drivers, really doesn't like the app that comes with their car. And so, yeah, we kind of looked for that central point, and then realized that, while we were mining Helium, obviously that it was time to drag and drop that model, obviously heavily inspired by the method of incentivizing the creation of this network. And I think it's something that's going to be applied to lots of other domains. We'd love to see it move over into the public transit space. That's something that is near and dear to my heart. I spent 6 years helping public transit agencies deliver better service and incorporate new technologies. And I think a lot of that is going to kind of come full circle and compound and build on what we're working on, what Helium's working on.
Yeah, so I mean, I think you can do this without crypto, but crypto kind of superpowers it. We now have a global coordination substrate to solve global coordination failures, like the funding of digital open source software. But what I would love to tell people about is how what we've pioneered in the crypto ecosystem is now being backported into meat space. So we're one of the largest deployers of quadratic funding in the world, which is, again, just matching contributions based off of the number of contributors instead of the amount funded, which is a more democratic way of funding an ecosystem. And when COVID hit, we actually took quadratic funding and we went to the Boulder Chamber of Commerce. I'm from Boulder, Colorado. And we said, hey, all these retail businesses are really suffering from a 90% drop in foot traffic because of COVID. This is in March of 2020. And we said, we have this thing, quadratic funding, that we would like to run in downtown Boulder. And we recruited a coffee shop, a comic book shop, a bookstore, and a yoga studio to do a quadratic funding pilot. And turns out it works really well. Just in meat space, we did $50,000 and about 2,000 contributions from the crowd. So this is an example of something that was pioneered in the crypto space that's been backported into the real world to support real world public goods. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for cross-pollination.
Yeah, I think that's a super important point to reiterate, because a lot of the public goods that already exist just need to be upgraded. It's not just about creating new public goods. It's about connecting digital technologies, the new tools that we have that have largely been developed by massive corporations that we all kind of feel like we're in this, sort of evil dance with. But one example from DIMO land is like one of the long-term outcomes of what we're building, I think, is that we can end up turning the DMV into smart contracts. And so there's a huge amount of effort that we've put into determining and kind of nailing down a definition of what each vehicle is, down to the VIN number, what features it has. That's going to extend into title and registration and allow people to kind of rethink our relationship with a lot of these government entities that a lot of people don't necessarily really like, but feel like they have to kind of deal with as part of just being a human and owning a car. And so a lot of that stuff, we don't approach from like an antagonistic viewpoint. We're really thinking about like how do we take a public transit agency or public fleet or the DMV and plug in a lot of these new tools that have been created, because I think they're mature enough to handle the transaction volumes and the user experience is getting better. And ultimately, it's if everybody decided like I don't actually have to go to the DMV anymore, I think that would probably be a pretty good thing.
I mean, any project that means that I don't have to wait 3 hours at the DMV sounds pretty good to me.
You just have to wait for your transaction to clear, and then you're good, yeah.
Let me just actually add an interesting anecdote relative to Waze and whether or not crypto, you can do this with cash versus crypto, which I think is an interesting question. So Waze, everybody here knows Waze. There's really two parts of contributions to Waze, right? There's what we do in terms of using the app, right? And then sometimes you're like, oh, there's a cop here, or like there's an accident here, that kind of stuff, right? That's obviously important. There's another part of it where there's about 25, 30,000 people sitting in front of a screen, literally like, drawing like this is a one-way street, there's a stop sign here. And so given that that was not all crypto-based, when Google acquired that, who made all the money? It was all the employees and their investors, right? But the real value came from this data network and these 20 or 30,000 people who are sitting down there. By the way, those 20 or 30,000 people still work for free for Google, which is like a $1.8 trillion company, right? Just like mind-blowing. I don't think many of them actually realize they're working for Google, unfortunately. And so I think if Waze was constructed as a crypto network, it would have effectively made it quasi-impossible for Google to acquire that, right? And so I think they've effectively, over the last 5 or 7 years that they've owned it, they're in the process of destroying it because they just were taking out a potential competitor, right? And so by creating a true crypto network, you make it more resilient to just all of these technologies and data networks ending up back in the hands of Google or Apple or whoever it may be.
So are you recruiting former Waze volunteers?
They know where to find us.
So something that Andy mentioned earlier is, that this has room to expand, right? So you guys are all in your own lanes, but are there other public goods that you think could benefit from a model like this?
I think healthcare data is a really big area. It's obviously, pretty sensitive. It's private. There's a lot of value that could come out of aggregating that in a new way that can deliver health insights to people. I hear a lot of people, kind of come inbound to us saying, I want to do DIMO for healthcare. And we have a lot of stuff on our plate right now, so we're not going to tackle that, but it's certainly something that, there's a massive amount of data being collected from wearables, electronic, medical health records, I think, would benefit a lot. I'm not saying we should put everybody's healthcare data on the blockchain, certainly not, but I think there is something there as far as how that information can be aggregated and used to help people out. And I think the electric grid is also another area where that's like kind of the original user-owned IoT network, and it's obviously a huge part of getting us out of the mess that we're in as far as climate change, and that does have a pretty direct impact with what we're doing as far as how we want to incentivize people to charge their vehicles with clean power. And yeah, there's a pretty incredible model. Like every electric utility basically has a different governance structure, like different incentives, and there's some really interesting stuff that gets done in that world as far as how they're governed and expanded, and good parallels to draw there.
I'll start with one that you shouldn't do, which is drones. Like I see a lot of people coming to me and be like, "Oh, we're gonna build a map of the world with drones." I tried that; it doesn't work right now. And the reason it doesn't work is around battery technology and around government regulation. So those problems will get solved over time, but it'll take a while. The one I think is interesting, maybe not directly a public good, but I think is something around Uber, Lyft. And I haven't yet seen interesting approaches to this one in terms of, building a crypto Uber version, or because a lot of that adversarial relationship between Uber and its drivers, I think, stems from the fact that the Uber drivers have no true ownership stake in Uber, right? So most of the value is accruing to the shareholders and to the employees. When I don't think, look, that underlying all of the Uber is the fact that somebody went out, bought a car for $20,000, $30,000, whatever it is, and is now spending 8 hours driving around that car. And yeah, sure, they're making money from it, but they don't have any ownership stake in it. And so I think if you can shift that ownership stake, then I think it gets interesting. Technically, I think it's really hard, right? Because every single ride is its own SKU, and so you're making these near real-time decisions that tend to be better managed centrally. So I think that's the critical tension point between, if you're going to do that, figuring out a solution to that, I think is critical.
Yeah, I think, yes, there's areas to cross-pollinate mechanisms and funding sources across different public goods. I envision Web3 as being the Trojan horse for a pluralistic web-scale infrastructure for funding public goods and upgrading democracy to web scale. And there's going to be a plurality of mechanisms: quadratic funding, dominance assurance contracts, effective altruism, conviction voting, tokenization we've talked a lot about. And there's going to be a plurality of funding sources. It's going to come from high net worth donors. It's going to come from layer 2 sequencer fees, NFT auctions we've been experimenting with. And I think that there's going to be a plurality of funding mechanisms and funding sources. And we're going to build this beautiful overlapping set of concentric circles of different public goods that are going to cross-pollinate mechanisms and funding sources together, and hopefully be the foundation of how our digital infrastructure is funded. And I just want to agree with what the other speakers have said about what's at stake here. I don't want to live if the metaverse is going to be the world's everyone's interface with the world is going to be intermediated by the digital. If we're building that, and that's what the metaverse is, I don't want it to be owned by Zuckerberg or Bezos or the Google shareholders. So I think that that's what's at stake when it comes to building this infrastructure for bottoms-up funding of community-owned public good infrastructure.
Kevin, something you've talked about a lot in the past is, the idea of regenerative finance, right? Is that where that fits in?
Yeah, I think so. We have been writing a little bit about how crypto can regenerate the world. And so just regeneration means a system that resources go up over time, as opposed to degenerative, which is just a system where resources go down over time, where they're captured by a minority of people. And so basically, we're kind of starting to map out what we call the impact DAO space, which is any DAO that has positive externalities for the world. And I think that it's in this network of impact DAOs that are working on all these amazing things that we're going to cross-pollinate a lot of mechanisms and create a lot of momentum for regenerative crypto economics. And I hope that that's a major theme of an upcoming cycle of crypto projects, is things that actually object level help people, I think, is what the capital allocators should optimize for.
Was Constitution DAO an impact DAO?
I am not sure.
That's fair. Okay, so I think we have some time for questions from the audience. I hope you guys have some burning questions. I don't know if there's mics going around, but if you want to raise your hands, if you have a question for our panel, one over there.
I hope this is not a silly question. I remember in the Web 2 stage, we have a company called Waze, right, which was acquired by Google. I just want to know, how we are going to do better, compared to Waze. Is that just because of the incentive system is different, or there's other way to make this, work more efficiently compared to the, Waze of the Web 2?
Okay, so Waze, so first of all, maps, there's a lot of different layers to maps, right? So Waze is definitely a very good at traffic specifically, right? Initially, they started out kind of building their own streets as well and places. They've effectively abandoned that now that they're owned by Google. But yes, from a traffic perspective, they did a good job. In terms of why, I think the crux of the question is like, why is HiveMapper better? Why is HiveMapper better than like a Google Maps as an example, is a couple things. One is it's about freshness, right? So let's just take the Google Street View car. Google Street View car, by where I live down in San Francisco Bay Area, let's take University Avenue and Palo Alto, which is Google's backyard. Google Street View sees that one street, which is fairly wealthy neighborhood in Google's backyard, maybe once every 12 to 14 months at best. If you then go to a place like Lagos, Nigeria, which is one of the largest cities, if not the largest city in Africa, growing like a weed, they see most streets in Lagos, Nigeria, maybe once every 3 to 5 years, right? So for that same cost, going back to the example of University Avenue in Palo Alto, a HiveMapper dashcam can see that basically once a week, right? So our ability to then refresh the map and refresh the map with very, very quality attributes is exponentially better, right? And therefore, it's a better map, right? The other part in terms of going to places like Africa, Southeast Asia, South America, Google is good, but it's a very, very expensive approach to mapping, right? And so what we can then do is say, okay, look, given that our costs are much lower, right? We're not buying the dash cams. It's not our cars. It's not our gasoline, right? These are already people who are out on the road. We can be mapping in places like Lagos, Nigeria, in places like Southeast Asia and South America, and do that much more frequently and build a much, much better map much faster than Google ever can because of Google's approach, which is inherently a good approach, but very expensive approach.
Any other questions?
There's one right here. Can drones be used for the? Can drones be used for the gated neighborhoods and such, places where you can't drive to?
Well, I look at the question of drones from the perspective of that airborne perspective, right? We have to have the airborne perspective, right? So whether that comes from satellites, airplanes, or drones, I think is the critical question. And so my perspective is that in the next 2 to 3 years, doing kind of large-scale mapping with drones is off the table. And so then the question is, okay, are you going to do airplanes or are you going to do satellites? It's a different topic, but I'll very briefly touch on that. Satellites, the approach that I liked in the satellite category was Planet or Planet Labs. Many of you may know that. In terms of this, lots and lots and lots of satellites, very, very, very high refresh. The problem with it was that it's very, very, very low resolution. So I think if you can solve that problem, then satellites are actually the best approach, right? You just get a large swath of the Earth, environmentally much more friendly than running airplanes and kind of these lawnmower patterns, right? And so I think there are some new technologies that are coming in the sensor world that will enable that. And I don't know, maybe HiveMapper will launch some satellites one day, we'll see.
How do you map gated communities?
Okay, so if you're talking about inside of gated communities, all of those different roads, hopefully we have the network grows to millions of contributors where there's somebody who actually lives inside of these gated communities who's driving to and from inside of these gated communities. That's one part. The other part is you have delivery vans, right? FedEx, UPS, others that are entering into these gated communities, right, to deliver packages. So that's another way that we can map inside of many of these gated communities. Good question.
Anybody else? If not, I have another question for you. So this all sounds really expensive, right? We're talking about drones, we're talking about satellites, and I think that we've focused a lot on what the utility of this is, and there's no question that there's a lot of utility, but what are some of the challenges? And I feel like just from my own reporting, I mean, a big challenge is how do you get the machinery that's needed or the knowledge that's needed into the hands of enough contributors that you really have a global network? I mean, we're talking about Lagos. How do you make this affordable and available to people who live there?
Yeah. So look, we're building the first 2 dash cams. Those are definitely a little bit more pricey. I think they're like $500 a pop each. So that's really where we need hardware partners, right? Like the beautiful part about what Helium did was engaged with a lot of hardware partners who really did the hard work and the amazing work of then building all these different kinds of devices for all these different kinds of markets. And so yes, there's definitely talking to a whole set of hardware partners that can help bring down the cost. I think that's one part of it, but also really understands the consumer in some of these different markets, right? Like, look, if you go to Russia, I don't know if you want to go to Russia right now, but if you did back in the day, like everybody there has a dash cam, right? And so there are specific reasons why a Russian driver has a dash cam, right? This is true in many other markets. And so I think if you understand why somebody is already buying a dash cam, right? Forget mapping here for a second. Then I think that you go in there and you say, okay, this is a 2-for-1, right? We're actually providing you real utility with this dash cam for something that you already need. And oh, by the way, it maps. And oh, by the way, you can actually earn some crypto. And here's the benefits of that and so associated with that. That's one part. The other part is there's a lot of entrepreneurs and investors who are saying, look, I'm going to buy 500 of these. I have relationships in Sao Paulo. I have relationships in Lagos, Nigeria. I understand that market. I'm going to go recruit Uber drivers. I'll buy the dash cams up front, go deploy them, and then we'll do a token split, right, with those drivers. I think that's a great approach as well. I got my hands full, but I would be doing that. So those are the kinds of things that we're doing to really get this out into the world beyond the US, beyond the UK, Canada, all the markets that it's already going to grow fine in.
Anything to add?
It's a very similar model with us as well. Obviously, different use case, and in our case, we're really kind of like servicing something that is already there as far as the data from these vehicles, and so building really friendly tools for developers, and then creating the conditions under which they can show up and say, "Wow, you've solved a massive problem for me. I don't have to go integrate with 12 different OEMs." One of the things we like to say is that our community is really great at owning every car, and so we have a really awesome place for somebody who wants to build a mobility application or already has an application that needs better mobility data, whether it's insurance or getting people more money when they go to sell their car. A lot of these things are going to happen at the edge of the network or within companies that are already doing these things. And so, we look at the challenge as creating the right conditions for a lot of these things to emerge, and then injecting capital or expertise or whatever else is needed to kind of like get the flame started. And we've seen some really encouraging things start to emerge from other projects that are crossing over. Helium hardware manufacturers approaching us saying, I want to make a telematics device, or I already make a telematics device. Let's put a secure element on it, get it certified for DIMO, and get it on your network. And on the other side, we have an incredible number of large OEMs that I never would have thought would be interested in what we're doing at this stage, who are thinking through the process of what it would look like to open up their vehicles more just because of what we're doing. And they've sort of thought through the game theory of like, if I do this and people, if I do this because people like it, it makes my product better and I'm going to sell more cars. So like creating those sort of game theoretical conditions where large companies want to participate in a network like this is something that we spend a lot of time thinking about and talking with people about. This isn't meant to be something that's just purely done by like individual open source developers. There's like huge teams of people that we need expertise from to be able to make this happen.
Yeah. So on the GitCoin side of things, we're more focused on the digital. GitCoin grants round 14, which has $3 million worth of matching, is going on for the next week and a half. So if you care about funding open source, check out GitCoin grants round 14. And we're just about to offer the technology, quadratic funding technology behind GitCoin grants to any community in the Web3 space. So if you want to incentivize your community, augment your grants program with the same technology that's working in Ethereum, you can come find me and we'll try to figure out how to set up a grants program for your community. Thanks so much for hosting, Cheyenne. This has been awesome.
Yeah, thanks,
thank you.
guys. And thank you all for being here.
Thank you.